Hocam bir büyük kitap var mı? Şöyle kalın, lüzumsuz information olan içinde. Hello.
Hi, merhabalar Veganım, nasılsınız?
Hanım nereden çıktı?
Aa, gene hanım, vallahi söylüyorum. Bir türlü lazım ya. Vega, nasılsın?
Oldu. Şeydeyim canım, derdim more make co-host. Derdim ne biliyor musun? Burada PowerPoint'im yok. Hi Alan. I'm such a cheap person that I refuse to buy Office for Apple. So I sent it from my Apple. It came to my, God damn it. It came to my PowerPoint. Of course, it opened up in Google, and now I cannot, I have a whatever PowerPoint. Let me see. Haluk.
Haluk nerede? Haluk yardımcı olsun istersen.
Are you kidding? Believe it or not, I'm the technical expert in this house. Haluk loves technology, but doesn't only his technology. You know what I'm saying? I used to.
Yeah, we don't know this person. Baka MacBook.
No, we don't.
She has to log in.
Yeah. So she knows it. Aynı zamanda Meryem de başka bir Zoom'a girecek de bütün şeyler bana geliyor. O bilmiyor.
Canım. Her ailede I'm only sending it to one per family.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. Alan. Okay. I think she has the... Sadece bir gideyim ben ona bir login yapayım gelin hemen. Vaktimiz var. Okay.
Alan, how are you? Long time no see.
Okay.
We're all surviving, huh?
Yeah. Oh, it's okay.
Okay. I hope that guy.
John, can I go down?
Dur bekle.
I have the meeting number.
Okay, you have everything. So take Ceyla with you too, please. Vega, bu geleceklerin listesi bende yok. Nasıl yapacağız?
Başka kimse de yok yani. Sana listesini nasıl yollarım?
Ben aslında şeye giderim. Evite'e girin ben. Evite'de kimler evet dediyse.
Yani %90'ını tanıyoruz ve yani password varsa, arada bir iki tane passwordsız varsa, şimdi şu Allah'ın cezasını nereye koymam lazım ki? Bak şimdi, gördün mü review? Yani bana $150 sarf ettirecekler, aldıracaklar.
Almayın. Şimdi PowerPoint'le mi hazırladınız siz onu?
Tabii PowerPoint'te şunu save as a PowerPoint diyeceğim. Ne yapayım?
PDF de olabilirdi.
Peki. Good point. Save as, export to PDF. Okay, I'm sorry. Export to, actually, let's cancel. Benim gibi yapan bir insan 25 sene ne derler? Key note'a koyacağım diyor. No, desktop'uma koyarsam yapan insan niye gider kendine Mac alır?
Çünkü şeyden dolayı virüs alması daha az ihtimal. PC'nin virüs alması daha zor. Ben de ilk önce PC insanıydım ama şimdi ben de Mac oldum. Çünkü gerçekten Mac'e çok virüs gelmiyor. Ondan dolayı yaptık yani. İlk başta birazcık zorluk oluyor ama ondan sonra alışıyor insan.
İlk başlıyorsun ama bu nasıl? Bu iyi mi?
Mac mi?
Görüyor musun? Share
Yok,
screen.
şey yapmadınız daha. Share yapın bir bakayım.
Share yapsam bakacaksın tabii de. Zoom'a gitmem lazım. Zoom'a gidip
Evet, doğru.
window'larımı kapayıp şey nerede acaba bizim? Ona 5.45 mi dedik? Share screen, keynote preview. Hangisi? Keynote değil mi?
Keynote'daysa açıksa ben size şöyle tavsiye ederim. Bir bakalım. Oo, çok güzel, harika. Bir de bunu şey gibi yapsak, şu yandaki slaytlar view option'la sağda soldaki view deniliyor ya.
Nerede canım?
Ben burada sizin o şeyde şurada 3 tane slaytınız var. O 3 slaytın üstünde view diyor.
Ben Vega Sankur, ATSC'nin Association of Turkish Americans of Southern California küçük bir chapter'ının Now I'm gonna turn into English because our guest, although he speaks very good Turkish, is a native English speaker, and our talk is in English, and we have some American visitors, guests to come to this talk, so I'm going to switch to English. But I'm Vega Sankur. I am the president of a small chapter of ATSC, Association of Turkish Americans. Our chapter is Atamla. It basically preoccupies itself with Ataturk's ideals, principles, and how to educate our community and American public and our young Turkish Americans in Ataturk's ideals and principles. And on top of it, we do have an Ataturk Kültür Merkezi, Ataturk Cultural Center, that is a community center that we have established last year with all of your help. Now I'm gonna turn this thing on, and then I'm gonna start sharing this, and I'm gonna give you some instructions, and you better obey them because Gülhan is my co-host, and she's very serious about this. Okay. So I'm gonna be doing Gülhancığım, maybe you share my PDF.
Okay.
Is it sharing?
No, yours hasn't been.
Okay, a couple of instructions while Gülhan is opening up the PDF. Please, we do ask that everybody mutes their audios, because there is a lot of really bad echo if we don't do that. And also, I'm gonna ask everybody to stop their videos. When we stop that, the transmission is much, much better during crowded meetings like this. Today's really main event is Professor George Gawrych is honoring us with his talk. But before we get to that, I'd like to say a couple of words as Atesi Atamla, who prepared this program. 23 Nisan kutlamamıza hoş geldiniz. Or we welcome you to 23 Nisan celebrations. I know that everybody, you know, this is both National Sovereignty Day, but also Children's Day. And since morning, we had wonderful programs by Orange County School and children, the children who sent their pictures to ATSC. So we have really celebrated an incredible Children's Day. And now I think we came to the really opening up the Meclis and maybe have a little bit more thought-provoking instead of not just celebration, but thinking about why Ataturk formed this Meclis. How did he form it? What kind of difficulties or help he had? And what was his vision in forming this? And there is no better person to present that than Professor George Gawrych. A lot of you are familiar with him from his visit here 4 years ago. Gülhan, if you could change it to the next one.
Oops, sorry.
Hmm?
That's it, huh?
Yeah, the next slide, please.
This is the, okay, sorry. This is the one.
No, it's the next slide that I'm looking for. Maybe I can't say the words, but I really need the third slide, so work on it hard.
It is
I
just
am pressing.
page down, because this is PDF.
I do. I know. I do page down and it didn't do it. So just a minute, please.
Okay, that's, yeah.
So you want page 2?
Yeah, page 2.
Here we go.
Now, when we formed this chapter, we realized that Ataturk, does an incredible amount of work, but maybe there was not enough focus to our republic and the ideals and the principles of it. So we basically formed this to continuously educate the public, especially American public as we get to it, community and young Turkish Americans in Turkish culture, life accomplishments of Ataturk, and the ideals and principles of the secular Turkish Republic. And I started for me to prioritize what I think Ataturk's ideals is, and I could write 10 things, but to me this 5 was the most important. Probably for other people it could be other, but this is peace, secular government, equality of all. We always talk about women's equality, but he advocated equality for all, self-determination, both for the country and also forming the democracy. And to me, the most important is rational thought and the education based on rational thought. So if we could teach these things, if we could spread these ideals, not only to us, but educate the American public, I think that we will do quite a bit of service. And we felt that if we had a community center where we could focus people on these, that we could accomplish our educational purposes better, as well as having a community center for Turkish Americans. Next slide, please. Okay, what are we doing in Atamlı or AKM activity? Well, we celebrate our national days. Today is 23 Nisan, but we do celebrate, and we try to celebrate them more on a cerebral way, maybe the thoughts and the ideals behind it. As far as music goes, we have a choir. We have given 3 to 4 concerts already. We have 30 people, and we have a repertoire of 30 songs already. We have a folklore group. We opened up Turkish classes. As far as literature and poetry goes, we have a book club that we're starting up. And there is all these on the left side, the tree And this is how we grew up with our own culture and values. And through this tree, we're trying to bring them into fruition in American soil. So that's what we are doing. And it is very fitting. You can close the PowerPoint, Gülhan. And it is very fitting to have Dr. George Gawrych here to talk to us how and why the Meclis was established 100 years ago today. Dr. Gawrych is a history professor at Baylor University. He is very fluent in Turkish and very fluent also actually not only today's Turkish, but the Arabic writings. And he has spent considerable time in Turkey researching in Turkey in the archives or so. And he authored a book, The Young Ataturk, that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. And he was here 4 years ago to talk about that. And we had some exciting times for those of you who remember. But George, with all the harassment, bless his heart, continued talking about it and fascinated all of us by talking about the human aspects of Ataturk, the young guy from Selanik who became the Ottoman officer and basically the hero of the independence war. So without much ado, I'm gonna turn this over to George Gawrych. And if you could, Gülhan, pin the screen on George, we're ready to listen to his very exciting talk. Hi, George. Now you're on the screen full.
And I hit the...
No, don't share anything. First say hello. Okay.
Okay. Vega Hanım Association of Turkish Americans of South Carolina, California, and the Ataturk Kültür Merkezi. Davetinize çok teşekkür ederim. Konuşmama hoş geldiniz. Size memnuniyetle geliyorum. İstiklal Harbi esnasında Ataturk hakkında bir kitap yazdım. It's not moving though. Did it move?
No, it hasn't. You are still in the first page.
What? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'll say it again. İstiklal Harbi esnasında Ataturk hakkında bir kitap yazdım. Bu akşam İstiklal Savaşı'nda Büyük Millet Meclisi önemi üzerine konuşacağım. Turning to English. You all know that Ataturk landed at Samsun on the 19th of May in 1919. And what was important about his landing there was he was going to assume leadership of the national resistance movement. And there's no way that you could have had a resistance movement established on the western side in Europe because of the Allies occupying Istanbul and the Greek army moving into Western Thrace. What's important to capture is what was the situation when he landed at Samsun. The Greeks had already begun landing their expeditionary force in Izmir, and the first shots of the War of Independence, you could say, were fired before he even landed. When he landed, there was already a demonstration taking place in Istanbul. And what is interesting is you find on your left, Halide Edip made a famous speech rallying people opposing the occupation and the division of what's left of the Ottoman Empire. And if you had the sign in front of her, it was quoting Wilson's principle of self-determination. So women were very much involved. So when we talk about women and men being part of the national resistance, the people including both genders. And what is amazing about Halide Edip and her role in the Turkish War of Independence is that Ataturk integrated her well into the resistance movement. She traveled with him, she ate at a dinner table with him, and she left us a memoir that gave us some very good insights into Ataturk as a leader, as an individual, as a person. And then throughout Anatolia, there were national rights societies forming to try to resist the partition of the country. So you do see that there was a ferment in the population of Anatolia to resist, but you needed a leader. If you looked at in Istanbul, the Sultan Caliph was under the thumb of the allies who occupied Istanbul, but within Istanbul, a good part of the military would support Ataturk and his resistance movement by supplying weapons to the resistance, providing intelligence. So we really see that on the one hand, the people are being aroused to fight for their dignity, to fight for their independence, but they lack the leader. The second thing that's important to keep in mind is the country was devastated by war, and not everyone wanted to resist. And eventually Ataturk would have to fight internal rebellions against his movement and the struggle against Allied occupation. As a successful military commander, what was clear, I think, in Ataturk's mind, to have a resistance, you needed clear objectives. The objectives had to be noble, and you had to articulate them simply. So he landed at Samsun on 19th of May, and on the 22nd of June, he went to Amasya, and there with a few other important individuals in the resistance, they came up with the Amasya Circular. And it was clear what the objectives of the resistance would become: territorial integrity, the unity of Anatolia and Western Thrace and Istanbul, extending into Mosul, complete independence, and the realization that the center of gravity of the resistance could not be on the western side of the empire, which meant the nation had to take matters in its own hands. This is what the Amasya Circular said. If you think about what it was saying is the power had to be built in Anatolia, it had to grow, and success would come there. It is almost a very revolutionary statement about where does Istanbul, the Sultanate, and the Caliphate fit into this when you're not part of the resistance. And the circular called for the establishment of a national committee. In other words, if the center of gravity is in Anatolia, you had to have an executive committee that would run the resistance, not from Istanbul, and you needed a national congress. The national congress would mobilize the nation, the people, along these clear objectives. And it stated in the circular that the congress would be held in Sivas. So the vision is clear, and the initial means for building the resistance was going to be a national congress and mobilizing the people. What about the army? Ataturk was able to have some key commanders, including Kazim Karabekir in Eastern Anatolia, committed to the resistance. So he had military support, but it was not across the whole board of military units in Anatolia. But before the National Congress, he had to go to Erzurum because Karabekir wanted a regional congress there to mobilize the people quickly because he felt a threat coming in from the Armenians trying to establish a state there. So my wife and I, if I may have a personal story, traveled to Erzurum to go to the site of the Congress. And as I was in the building where the Congress was held, something really beautiful happened, which I share with students when I teach about Ataturk at Baylor University. Here is the building of the Erzurum Congress. And as I was there, lo and behold, look what came about. Turkish students came and they started asking me questions, why I was there, who I was, and I was speaking with them Turkish, and they found out I was an American. And look at the faces there. They're interested. The girl with her eyes closed, she is so interested. She is totally meditating on the words that I'm saying rather than sleeping standing up. And I show this picture to talk about how it is so important to have this almost innocence desire to learn about other people, what makes them tick, learn their history, learn their language, and look at the excitement that you find in this youth in an eastern part of Turkey as I am there. And what they did is they eventually invited me to come to their classroom and look at the face of the teacher. I tell the students, she welcomed me. She was excited to have an American to be able to answer some questions about my country. It was a beautiful experience and one that I carry over into my classrooms when I teach modern Middle East history at Baylor. The Erzurum Congress was followed by the Sivas Congress, and both of them clarified clearly what the goals of the resistance were going to be. And those goals would be the territorial integrity of the country, national independence, and the protection of the Sultan Caliphate. And Sivas Congress was different than the Erzurum Congress, is that it claimed to be a general congress representing the entire people of Anatolia and even Western Thrace and Istanbul. And both congresses formed an executive committee to direct the resistance and to create the Society for the Defense of Rights of Eastern Anatolia and then eventually Rumeli. What is interesting is before even the Erzurum Congress was held, I found a very interesting communique that Mustafa Kemal Pasha made to Ali Fuad, the 19th of May, a few days before the Erzurum Congress was held. And he said, for the proper execution of our duty as being interpreters of the national conscience, the Milli Vicdan of the nation and the motherland, we cannot appear to exercise authority on any problem without linking it to the national desire. And then he goes on to say, we prefer to have our relations with foreigners based on decisions made by Congress. What is he saying here? Congress, which represents the people, will be our source for claiming legitimacy, that we speak for the voice of the nation. And it means then that as we represent the people, we are really institutionalizing the principle of self-determination, which Wilson articulated to Congress at the beginning of 1918. So, Congresses provide a means for saying we have power, but our power is legitimate because we're speaking for the people. Now, what is interesting is then, as the Congress in Sivas was held, pressure came upon the government of Istanbul to hold an election for a new parliament. And that was very important because it fit into the tradition that Ataturk inherited, that going back to 1876, there was a constitution and a parliament for a couple of years. There was the bringing back of the constitution and constitutional government, though however weak it was, from 1914 to 1919, so that the calling of elections and holding of a parliament was already part of the evolving tradition in the Ottoman Empire in the political arena. The election was held in December, And Parliament eventually convened in Istanbul. Ataturk wisely did not go to Istanbul to attend it, but by taking an election, electing deputies and taking it to Istanbul to hold Parliament, you are taking it into the den of the lions where the allies are concentrated. And you're going to find that because of the nobility of the cause and the way it was articulated, the deputies that come together, some are very strongly supportive of Ataturk, some are a little more independent, will put together the vision for Turkey. And it is the Misaki Milli, the National Covenant, I call it. And Ataturk later on will say that this Misaki Milli is what the War of Independence, the Declaration of Independence in your history was. That's the equivalent. And what was in the National Covenant? Covenant meaning the people coming together and speaking united for noble goals. And it called for complete independence and sovereignty based on an armistice that ended the war for the Ottoman Empire. It was on the 30th of October, 1918. There would be no restrictions on political, judicial, and financial development within the state. There would be plebiscites held for areas that were under foreign occupation. And the text talked about loyalty to the Ottoman Sultanate. Naturally, it's an Ottoman parliament, but it also defined the country, identified the country as Turkey. Already a seed is being laid for a different official identification of what will be the new state. This National Covenant posed a threat to the Sultan, posed a threat to the allies. And what happens is the question, who blinks? And what happens is the allies blink. Rather than allow the parliament to keep generating these demands, they decide to move on to parliament and start arresting deputies. And this seals the fate of Istanbul as being a place where you could really have some kind of struggle for national independence. And the allies have shown their true colors. They've delegitimized their occupation in a way, if you sit back and think about it. They said, we don't care what the people want. We want our national interests, our colonial designs to be implemented. And the Sultanate is left in a very difficult situation. And this, in a way, helps to create a turning point. Now the question becomes, what are you going to do with the closure of the Ottoman Parliament if you are now sitting in Ankara and you are Mustafa Kemal Pasha? It's a pretty obvious decision. What he does is says we need to reconvene Parliament here. And the beauty of what the closure allowed to happen is they were unable, the British and their allies, to capture all the deputies. So some of the deputies courageously flee to Ankara to help establish the new parliament, the new Meclis. And among those who managed to escape is the president of the old Ottoman parliament, Jalaluddin Arif. Not a person in Ataturk's circle, but a person who was selected to lead the Ottoman parliament. Important linkage. And then what Ataturk does is he says we're going to have elections to have new deputies come in to constitute the new parliament here in Ankara. And elections are held. Not all the deputies can get there, the people that are elected, but with the societies for the defense of national rights of Rumeli and Anatolia, obviously organizations at the local level have started to move and support Ataturk. They're going to elect people who are on the same wavelength, the same program that he has. And what will be interesting from my point of view is here is an officer, a general, who has to make the transition to being a statesman. He has already taken off his military uniform and donned civilian clothes in Erzurum, and he will continue to do that to symbolize that I am not a military commander. I've been fired by the Sultan in a way, you could say that, but I am a civilian leading this rather than trying to put on a uniform. And what he tells a reporter, Yunus Nadi, before the holding of the first session of parliament, he says to him, for me, the Mejlis is not a principle, it is a reality, and the greatest of realities at this point in time. He doesn't say at this point in time. He says, Önce Meclis, sonra ordu. What he understands is that at this stage in the conflict, we need to build the power of the political vision, the political institution of the parliament, which gives the national resistance legitimacy, which speaks for the people. Lo and behold, parliament comes together on the 23rd of there's us, 23rd of April. And in one way, it is important to underscore that it is representative of society to some degree. 25% of the people have higher education, deputies. 19% have some madrasa education. There are 115 government officials. You have 61 teachers, 51 soldiers, 49 lawyers, 37 merchants, small, medium-scale farmers, large-scale farmers, some doctors, tribal chiefs, clerics. It is kind of a broad spectrum. What you don't have is women, you don't have Christians, and you don't have really poor farmers, peasants into this system. So in a way, it is reflecting more the society as a whole, which gives what it states, what it decides, more legitimacy. Ataturk understands this. And what is interesting then is how this parliament is going to be configured. It's one thing to bring the deputies together. It's another thing to decide how we're going to work as a new body here. And what is interesting is the name given to the parliament is the Grand National Assembly, Büyük Millet Meclisi. And what does the grand mean? Grand, in a way, means that unlike the United States, where there is a separation of powers between the executive, judiciary, and the legislative, what we will have is a unity of powers. Kuvvetler Birliği. The idea is that parliament will be the executive and the legislative. This, in some ways, strengthens the idea of this is a people's institution. So in some ways, as the law is kind of put together, the Kanun on the 2nd of May, it gives a lot of power to parliament, more than the Ottoman parliament had. So this is going to be very important. And then eventually next year in February, it'll add the word Turkey. So it's the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. Now, it elects Ataturk to be speaker, but I like to just bring a speech that he makes on this next day. The 23rd is established, the 24th is he makes a speech. And he divides, at the beginning of his speech, the national resistance movement into 3 phases. And to me, this was fascinating. And it made sense. And he was embracing rationally, systematically, how he saw history unfolding under his feet. First phase is the signing of the armistice, which is where the borders are of what we're going to claim is our rightful inheritance, to Erzurum Congress, the first regional Congress. Then he says the second phase is from Erzurum to Sivas, the National Congress, and the third phase is Sivas to the convening of the Grand National Assembly. What he is saying is, right now, as he told the journalist, Önce meclis, sonra ordu. And what that phasing description tells us is that he is saying we have matured as a political resistance, and now we can speak for the people. Powerful, powerful statement. Now, some people will say, well, he's going to talk about Islam. He's going to talk about the Ottoman society, using the word Ottoman. He's going to talk about protecting the caliphate and the sultanate. When you are forming a resistance, fighting for your independence, you have to try to hit the basic things that will mobilize most of the people. The common denominator. So what he is doing and how he's articulating the struggle and giving it some more features of identity. It has an Islamic component. It's an Ottoman component. It has to deal with the Ottoman Sultanate and Caliphate. He is going into the bottom line of what will bring the nation, people together, rather than appeal to your base, polarize the country even more, and keep doing it. God knows what will happen when you do that. And then in another speech, he stressed that we're here for our independence. We are here for our territorial integrity, and the added important factor, the Grand National Assembly is the true and sole representative of the nation. He's claiming this is the new capital. We would call it a provisional government with a provisional parliament. Now, the question also, it's also very important that as he puts this together, there is going to be a cabinet with a head, and it's parliament that picks the head of the cabinet and picks the members of the cabinet, and each cabinet member is directly elected by parliament. So delegation of power will be to the head of the cabinet and the cabinet, but it'll flow from the Grand National Assembly. He'll talk about a national army, and the military will be united, not in a ministry of war, but a ministry of national defense, because we are emphasizing defense. All the other, as my understanding, major European powers still talk about a secretary of war. Here we're talking about a minister of national defense. Very interesting. And it's here that if you go to the people, you have to talk about the government as a government of the halk hükümeti. It's the government of the people. And we've set it up to make it, on paper, the government of the people. Now, the question becomes, what kind of dynamic do you have in this parliament? Well, one thing Ataturk will do is interesting. Every deputy that was elected, that came to Ankara to enter the parliament, he spoke pretty much with every individual deputy. He wanted them to understand what the vision was and trying to get them on the same sheet of music, as we would say. Powerful. But as we know, no country, no organization is of one mind. And what we'll see that in the parliament, there'll be an internal dynamic where it'll be sometimes unruly. And what will be important is Ataturk will send the message that this is important, dynamic, the fact that we have some discussion, debate. I will attend and listen to some of these debates. I will stand before the parliament and outline what is going on and give some answers to questions. This is showing that he's clearly demonstrating deference to this institution to some degree. And one interesting point that comes out of this is you get a sense from his, clear sense from his presentation that he has a command of the details. He will talk about small unit actions, guerrilla actions, answer questions. His mind is integrating the small and bringing it up to the big picture. It gives us a better understanding. The second thing is that in his speeches, he will sometimes refer to documents, which is exactly what he does in Nutuk when he gives that 6-day speech in 1927. Amazing connections. But there is a frustration. And as a professor, I would say that what Ataturk does on March 1st, 1921, is he gives a report card to the parliament. He says in this speech, he says, you have met 159 days out of 311 days. You held 407 sessions, 51 of them secret, 356 public. You've passed 104 bills and rejected 149. You've presented so many to council of ministers and you've left so many behind. He's saying it has been a rather poor performance. But you have to give it some free play if you want it to symbolize in your relationships with foreign powers that it has a representative component to a complex society with some disagreements. But when push comes to shove, his charismatic, strong willpower will impose itself, but he'll learn, he'll understand which battles to fight or not. So this is very important. And then ultimately, this parliament has to define itself. How are we going to look at the power that we have? We need a provisional constitution. And that provisional constitution comes on 20th of January, 1921, the Teşkilat-ı Esasiye Kanunu, the law of fundamental organization. And in fact, this is passed actually a month and a half almost before the report card comes to Parliament. So it's done its most important part. And in there, this provisional constitution places sovereignty in the nation or the millet. And Parliament has both executive and legislative powers. So legitimacy for anything comes from the decisions of the Parliament, which has both executive and legislative powers, and it represents the people. And it identifies the state as the Türkiye Devleti, the state of Turkey, taking the Misaki Milli statement of Turkey, reiterating it, institutionalizing it into the provisional constitution. So now we clearly have a new identity for what the people are fighting for. And it doesn't mention the Sultanate and the Caliphate at all, which is revolutionary. It is a move toward, I would say, the Republic. And one thing that İsmet İnönü said, I think, years after the war, he said, we kind of knew we were moving in the direction of the Republic, but we weren't really talking about it much. So you could see that this is really a very important turning point to give legitimacy to Ataturk and the national resistance, for mobilizing the people, for the beginning of, let's say, maybe not the beginning, but moving much more forward with creating now a parallel state independent of the Ottoman state, but there'll still be some commanders that'll have to be reined in to fall under the umbrella of Ankara during this period of time. And when Ataturk in this war looks back at this law of basic organization, he says it is a ilahi kanun, a divine law. He makes it a sacred provisional constitution. Why? Because he says it represents the nation's conscience and conviction. Vicdan ve kanat. It is a struggle for people to be free. It is a struggle for dignity. And to some degree, it is recognizing that to do it, we need to do it together as a people, united as best we can. Now, I think I have 2 more hours, I'm just joking. Now, what is interesting is we get an idea of the important role that characterizes this revolution, that legitimacy comes from a representative institution brought about by elections, which had to be done because the Allies had discredited the previous election and crushed basically the Ottoman parliament. But to win a war, you cannot do it with politics alone. While Ataturk was building up Unce Meclis, Sonra Ordu, he was trying to manage the guerrillas, bring the army more under his control. So at Sivas, he establishes a Western command, trying to unite the military forces, the regular forces that are out there, the guerrilla forces, to unify the military. So he'll be waging some battles on different fronts, smaller, trying to build the army, but he will be criticized, you're spending too much time in parliament. This is where I need to be at this point in time. But eventually a crisis occurs on the battlefield, in the war, you could say. The Greek army has moved, they've captured Eskişehir, they're on their way to Ankara, and this is a crisis. Decision is made to start moving people out of the capital. And some of the deputies say, no way, we're going to join the army and fight. So in a way, you see within this institution that has bought off on the vision, that has a certain degree of freedom to express themselves, when push comes to shove, some are rising to the occasion and saying, we need to make a stand. Helping to embolden Ataturk and others to make a stand. But to make a stand, it's obvious you need a strong leader. And Parliament, from Ataturk's point of view, is a bit ineffective sometimes. So it goes before Parliament, and Parliament passes Kanun 141, Law 144. And it basically makes him the commander-in-chief. He is declared the commander-in-chief, which is something that in the Ottoman constitution was something that belonged to the Sultan. So this is another revolutionary step. You don't talk about the caliphate, the sultanate, you put all the power in the hands of the parliament, the Meclis, the assembly, and now you're saying the military part, we've got a whole new way of running this show militarily. But it limits him to 3 months in this position. It allows him, some will say, close to dictatorial powers in that he can make any decisions in the name of parliament in crisis that'll help the war effort. Now, he could interpret this in broad ways, true, but I think one thing, and this goes back to what he wrote to Ali Fuat before Erzurum Congress. He said, we need to let the people, the foreign states, know that what we decide represents the Congress. Now we have a Meclis. So treaties is one thing that Parliament will have to make the decision on. So you win the battle at Sakarya, the French will be willing to make some kind of agreement with you. You have to go to Parliament. He does, to explain it, to argue for it, and get the votes that he needs. So we could see And every 3 months, you'll have to renew it until eventually it's indefinite. So he is now, with this law, not only the head of the government by virtue of being the president, the Rais of Parliament, the Meclis, the Assembly, but also Başkomutan. When he makes commands to the army, he often signs it Başkomutan. After he wins the battle of the Great Offensive and the pursuit, he addresses the nation, not the army only, but he addresses them as the commander-in-chief, Başkomutan, and the Rais of the Grand National Assembly. So he is aware of the fact that he's wearing two hats, and both of them come from the Meclis. And Meclis being unruly, and as time goes on, we eventually see in 1920 the emergence of a second group. Not the first group, but the second. And this will be kind of like an opposition group within Parliament that'll have some free play. And to placate it to some degree, Ataturk, before the Great Offensive, picks Rauf Orbay to be the prime minister to kind of assuage the second group, because Rauf Orbay's temperament is in some ways closely related to the second group, because he's concerned about the amassing power of Ataturk during this struggle, as is Kazım Karabekir. And eventually, the war is won. The Greeks are thrown out, and we can claim a military victory. And in that, Parliament has played an important role in legitimizing the struggle, connecting with the people. And Ataturk was very sensitive that when he needed to call up a total war, Topyekun Savaş, he made sure it came through Parliament, and it was done at a critical moment. End of story? I would say no. We need to just take it a little bit more after the war is over with. Because in war, it's not only important to win militarily, but what are you going to do politically? Otherwise, you can undermine your war effort if you weren't smart in how you run with politics. This, to me, was impressive. And it slowly began to sink in. Let's turn to the year 1923, the establishment of the Turkish Republic, I should say the Republic of Turkey. How do we get there? What to me is interesting is, having won militarily, we've moved into a period of negotiations for a peace treaty. We're in a period of no war and no peace and no treaty. And there's a concern that we can't go into fighting more. Things are tense. Things are tense. What Ataturk decides to do is, on the 14th of January, he goes out and does a tour of a good part of Anatolia, Western Anatolia, to Izmir, doing the south and going up, I think, all the way to Mersin. Now, one of the things that he'll be doing is inspecting. If you look at what he does, he's going to ask questions. How are you taking care of the wounded? How many schools do you have? Are the girls getting educated? Asking, what about roads? He's going to want to get a feeling for the country. But at the same time, he's also trying to strengthen his power and move the country to a new election for a new parliament. İkinci Meclis, the second parliament. He feels empowered, but he's not totally in control. He understands that. But I think he has confidence in the nobility of the cause, the prestige and power that he has accumulated, that we can do this. So part of his tour is campaigning. And in some places he tells people who to vote for, their ideals that I think he probably thinks he can only do. So during this period, he does if you look at the period of the War of Independence to the beginning of his tour, he does 18 public addresses. During the period of only several months, he does 34. He meets with women, he meets with men, he meets with farmers. He's reaching out to the people. Halkadoru. Halkadoru on Samsun on May 19th, Halkadoru now in the post-war period. And he moves up the elections. And what is interesting is the elections occur in July. The Treaty of Lausanne, which is in many ways a victory, and many of you know that it gets the territorial integrity, unity. It has some, it's not a perfect one, but Turkey gains its independence, and it is, and Ataturk would be an ideal, a model for a lot of Arabs even during this interwar period, World War II, as a person who really led the country to independence. The second parliament meets on 11th of August. So the people in negotiations understood a new election was taking place, and it ratifies the treaty on the 23rd, a new parliament has ratified the treaty, and it is representing what? A new election, a new parliament to head for the future, to move toward the establishment of the republic. The other thing that's so fascinating about this period is Ataturk has stated this earlier, but he brings this out during his tour of Anatolia. He says, I am going to establish a halk firkası, a halk partisi. I am going to establish a people's party. And what is interesting is the role he describes for it. In my mind, he envisions the reforms that are going to come are going to be dependent to a large extent on the party, because he assigns to his party in his vision statement and what he's telling the people, it'll mobilize the people, it'll educate the people. And what is interesting then is that he is giving it an important role, and he saw education as very important. We all know how much of an intellect he had, that it was in many ways a cognitive revolution. And he addressed the Education Congress on the eve of having to go out and inspect the battles as they were going out in the West, that the Turkish army was being pulled back. So he's giving a Congress and giving a speech to it in the midst of war. They'll do one immediately after this war, during this period. Which means then, once the Republic is established, we'll see that this man in his travels, this is his tour, look at him, uniform. He's inspecting troops. Now he is with the people, and the child is giving him poetry. He's in civilian clothes. And as I looked at some of the pictures, it seemed like he was aware who was my audience. If I have a lot of officers around me, but I'm talking to civilians, it's a civilian attire. I am separating my military versus my political role. Ultimately, I'm going to be the civilian. Okay, so when the Republic is established, what'll be clear is that Parliament will vote for it, a new Parliament, and the future will be built on where the national resistance started, on building a political party that'll be a major instrument of reforming the country, transforming it. The army will be put in its barracks with the idea of being there for national defense, for dealing with the unrest. So you could see that the importance of politics in war grows in deeper understanding and application after the war. And this is really, in some ways, a genius. And what do you do next? You find and you have a new constitution in 1924. And because you're not controlling things like you couldn't do it with the first parliament, you eventually see the emergence of the Progressive People's Republic, a Progressive Republican Party. And then eventually what happens when Ataturk dies, we all know İsmet İnönü will do what? Have free elections, have opposition party in 1950 win the election, he'll turn over power, and here's a commander in that spirit, in that culture around Ataturk, who will say, perhaps my greatest victory will be my political defeat in handing over power to the opposition. An amazing story, and in their parliament, the Büyük Millet Meclisi played a very important part in telling the world we speak for the people, telling the people we can make demands because we represent you to some degree. And Ataturk has helped to put this all together. Thank you very much. Now what happens? Do I sneak off into the sunset?
No, nothing like that.
Did you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I should say no in case there's sonda anlaştık.
Anlaştık. Thank you. Thank you.
It was fantastic talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? You can now unmute yourselves and be able to ask questions. The first question.
I don't have a question. Well, I will have a question, I guess, but I actually have a comment. What I took from this, well, what impressed me most was your mention of Ataturk or Mustafa Kemal at that time, saying that the Meclis or the assembly is really the legitimate source for rules governing the nation, for governing the legitimate body to govern the nation. And I think there's a lot in that that politicians of today can actually learn from.
Exactly, exactly. And not to polarize.
I'm sorry?
Not to polarize, but to realize you're trying to represent the nation.
Right.
All classes, and that's why eventually, because if you think about one of the principles that comes out of this struggle is halkçılık, populism. The idea that we don't want to have classes, we don't want to set people against each other, we want to work for everyone. And that's important for politicians to hear today. In America, we're so polarized. Turkey has polarization as well. And the world is experiencing a lot more anger and frustration and camps. And politicians unwilling to try to transcend that, to heal people and bring them together.
Yes. And I think there's a saying in English, the worst peace is better than war. I think the same applies here. The worst assembly is better than a dictator.
Well, the issue will be, there are always going to be shades. For example, one of the things that's threatening our democracy is the way it has become dysfunctional. So what do you do when you have elections and government is polarized and it's dysfunctional? So there are pluses and minuses in any kind of institution that you create. But I agree, the idea of freedom of the press, elections, democracy are very important.
George, I have a question. This is Vega. If you're asking questions for others, could you please identify yourself? This is Vega, and I've got a question. You've done a lot of research about Ataturk. So do you think that in 1920 even, he was thinking that he would ultimately form a republic at the end of, if he wins the war, that his ideal was to form a republic, or did it kind of work its way because of Sultan's positions and you know, the inefficiency, the ineffectiveness of the Sultan or whatever? Or do you think that, you know, the day that 1920, he was saying, let's pave the way to republic?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I would say that it would seem that in my mind, at this point, you're not going to be thinking too clearly, too much about where this is going to end up.
Okay.
But I think if you look at already in the Caucasus, there is a Muslim republic established, that the system you're creating is delegitimizing the Sultanate and the Caliphate. You are inspired to some degree by the French Republic and what it has accomplished in the French Revolution. Those are things in him. I would say that there would be an awareness that we can move toward a republic, a temperament, a predisposition, but one that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be thinking about it and articulating it. But like Ismet Inanü said, as this thing is unfolding, we're realizing we're moving more and more away from what is in Istanbul, and what we're really creating is a kind of government that is going to be a republic. So I would say there is at least a semi-conscious awareness of we could end up with a republic on this.
Okay, I see.
Vega Hanım, Oylum wants to ask a question. So Oylum, would you like to?
Oylum asked her question, didn't she? Because I just saw Oylum talking. Okay, if Oylum wants to go one more time, sure, go ahead.
I was the first one who.
Yeah, it was Erdal, I think, or some. Okay,
All right.
Oylum, it is your turn. After that, Metin Manger will ask his question. Oh, wait, Oylum, unmute yourself. Oylum, unmute.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Please go ahead.
Perfect. Well, thank you for this informative session. It's really great, at least from my standpoint. I'm sure there are going to be people who will agree with me to hear our founder from a foreign historian like yourself. So throughout your speech, you mentioned in one, and I zeroed on that, because I've heard you use the term almost dictatorial when you were talking about the Meclis and how he formed the Meclis and how he was visionary and putting everything around to make sure that things are coming out of there is the representative of, representative of everybody. So, so this is one part where I'm sure there are other people who are going to be probably agreeing, is in a polarized country right now in Turkey, that there is one side that says, well, he was kind of dictatorial. So I just want to, this is something that I really don't understand. I can't get my head around. What do you mean by that dictatorial power? And let's talk about this in that society where there's already a person, Sultan, who holds everything in his hand anyways. The people don't have any choice.
Oylum, I will cut you here. So can you make your question much shorter so that we will have more time for the other people?
Yeah, so I just want to understand this a little bit. When you said dictatorial, I want to really see from your eyes, what do you mean by that?
What I said was that some people would say that when you give him those kind of powers in Law 144, that he speaks in the name of Parliament for 3 months. During that period of time, he has strong powers. And some would say dictatorial, but I said at the same time, he did not take everything. He understood that treaties are going to require Parliament's approval, and it's only for 3 months. Maybe a better word would be not what the people would use, but authoritarian, a person who's concentrating power in himself, amassing power at the expense of other institutions. So he does respect the fact that Parliament has to be involved in key decision making. You're going to have an election, but certainly he is going to be an authoritarian ruler. More and more power will be coming to him during the Republic.
And
Thank you.
And the problem with dictatorship is we have created such a negative term. It's like in America, you don't want to say socialist because it means communist, when really we've bastardized the term.
Yes.
So I think authoritarian would be, so I would agree with you. Authoritarian would be, I would prefer, and I use.
And it's an authority given to him by the Parliament because they're in such dire straits.
Right, sure.
You cannot mobilize an army from zero to victorious by 300 people voting on it. Sometimes things get done by focusing the authority on one person. Or
Exactly, in crisis.
group.
Because when we have a crisis like now, the government has to take more power, and we're complaining that we're not getting enough national leadership. So Ataturk is given powers, but only for 3 months. And some people are saying, well, okay, you fix it. If you don't fix it, we can get you. So there's going to be some people who are going to try to take advantage of a defeat. But there's a realization somebody has to take charge in a decisive way, and he's willing to take that responsibility. He's willing to go out in the field and direct it. And what I told students at the staff college when I was teaching for 19 years, U.S. Army Command and Staff College would be for majors and lieutenant colonels. We usually had about 3 or 4 Turkish officers. Is he's taking on responsibility. And he has been a statesman. He's been working the political arena, but now he says, I'm going to go out in the field. I'm actually going to command. So you remember that famous picture of him sitting in Sakarya and he's observing with his binoculars? Or during the Buyuktardos, the Great Offensive, he's on the top of that hill and he's seeing things and he's making decisions. So it is a commander who is political leader. He's on the battlefield, but he's not far back in the headquarters, but he has committed himself to observing and making decisions when necessary. So he has taken on full responsibility. You're not going to have that in the 20th century like that.
Okay, thank you. So next, oh, no, Oylum, sorry. Okay, you can say it one more time.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to say that this is more circumstantial. It's not like something that is given to him and he has just went and run with it.
Okay.
Just like Vega Hanım mentioned that it was in a crisis situation. That clarifies it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Metin Manger, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Professor Gawrych. I really learned even more in this. This is more of a comment. You described how Ataturk sort of cajoled or formed the Turkish the Meclis and made it work and pushed it along his vision. That is, a fantastic ability. He wasn't only a commander, a fantastic commander, but he knew how to manage this group of people and direct them in the along his vision, which really most of the time we don't think about that. We just say, well, he went through Erzurum and Sivas and then formed the Meclis and he fought the wars and won. But what you described in quite detail, which is really important, how he knew that this was politics and he knew how to do it. That is another astounding ability, which really makes him another reason why he's such a great leader. Thank you for pointing that out.
And add to that, I taught for 19 years at the Command and General Staff College, and I have Middle East warfare course, had a 3-hour lesson on the War of Independence. And that was maybe 17 years. And those 17 years, virtually every American officer and every international officer said this guy was a genius to be able to balance the two together, politics and war.
Yes.
Unofficially, I'll say some of the Saudi officers had a difficulty because he said he's not a Muslim or he's too critical. But one Saudi officer quietly, he whispered in my ear during a break, okay, he was a genius, but he should have retired in 1922.
Okay.
So, Beka Hanım,
One private question. Gülhancığım, we have one private question on the chat
ondan
from Rakshan.
yes, Roshan. Roshan was the next person. Please go ahead, Roshan. Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time, and also kudos to you for making achieving that a teenager could listen. I have my son with me, so to this talk, so it means a lot, I think. So it was very interesting. So my question is, you partly pointed to it when you were answering the other question, but how would you compare? A lot of us might be grown or might have been educated in a way that we have a certain view of Ataturk. But I would like to hear you as a historian and somewhat of as an outsider to the culture, or being not Turkish or not being educated in Turkey. How would you compare him to other leaders? What do you find unique about him? And also, do you think he was influenced by someone or something or somebody, knowing that he was very well read? Do you think he had influences that he?
Yeah, every person is unique, but leaders like that have to have a certain degree of arrogance, a certain degree of ambition. So that there are certain qualities that leaders have in general to aspire to such a position and to say, I can lead a country, I can lead a nation. And some are stupid in thinking they could do it. The things that struck me about Ataturk, and it's great to teach, it was great to teach him at a Command and General Staff College, is he is one leader who is extremely well read. And he reads lots of things. He's dealing with all sorts of different fields, which is very unique for leaders. Probably the closest we've had in recent times is Obama, who's well read. He will read literature. I remember finding in a letter he wrote to a woman in, can you still hear me?
Yes.
He wrote to a woman saying, I'm fighting and I'm living in a hell here in Gallipoli. I'm fighting for my humanity. Send me some French novels so I can read to help me hold on to my humanity. He's using literature. So one thing that is, I think, very important for him as a leader is he's extremely well read. At the same time, he has a practical sense to him. So it's not like he's always out in the clouds, but I think he's combining in a good way the idea of theory and trying to understand the nature of things, and then a practical application. So when we look at the educational system that he creates after declaring the Republic, he's going to emphasize a lot, make sure we're teaching practical application of what we're doing in the classroom, because the practical is very important. And the willingness to look to people and those sofras that he had to bring in experts and literary people to understand that it's not just science, it's not just history, but it is the arts that's important. It's poetry. He loved poetry. He loved literature, because literature puts you more in touch with the spirit, the feelings of people. So I think he developed well this idea of intuition, the idea of being able to connect with people. And in a way, he was given by fate, destiny, God, however, beautiful eyes that kind of drew the person into him. And when he talked to him, he was totally focused on you. You were like the only person in the room. But at the same time, to survive in this kind of environment, it's a difficult environment. There were people out to get him. There was a lot of violence, civil unrest, massacres. You have to some degree be ruthless too, make hard decisions. And then when he did, if I may just point this out, what I found was fascinating, and he puts the civics book together. Afit Inan says, you know, he basically put it together. I just wrote it down. In this discussion of the army, he says one thing we have to be aware is that senior military commanders have to make decisions that are merhametsizlik. Isn't that a powerful statement? Without mercy. So he understood too that sometimes you have to make very difficult decisions. So that combination is amazing, and working with people. Great listener.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Okay, can I think that we're kind of getting to the end of our times. Could you maybe give it back to me, Gülhan, for a moment? My video?
Your video, you mean,
Oh, I start just 1 second, George, yeah. In the name of ATSC and the Turkish American community, George, thank you very, very much. I mean, it's been so informative that every time I talk to you, I understand maybe another aspect of what happened during those years. It just inspires you so much. And those of you that are on the line, before we applaud Dr. Gawrych, I'm gonna show you this book of his, Young Ataturk. And if you want to learn about Ataturk more, this is a wonderful book about his youth and what prepared him for this big struggle and big victories. But I would like to thank George, and if you could turn it back to George, and everybody unmute your phones, and let's give him a big hand.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. We love you.
Thank you. It was a great honor.
And your reactions, thumbs ups. We were gonna have him here in person, and I'm really hoping we will have him after this conference in Southern California in person. George, again, thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts.
You're welcome. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, George.
Thank you. And if anybody you could always email me if you have some things that would help me, because my second book is to try to understand Ataturk in the Republic and the changes he's made there. And as one question was made, the problem I'm having is his mind is so many places. Capture that is beyond my abilities, but to at least let people know how those different parts of his readings come together, because he's a person who is holistic. Everything has to be put together, interrelated, and that's a pretty impressive mind that's possible for us mortals to capture. Thank you.
This is our goal. You're definitely going to get an email from me.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
bye.
So I'll end, right?
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, George.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.